Okay, good evening, CJ. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Baruch Hashem. Good evening, Ari. You're muted. It's fine. Feel free to. So we're gonna try it like this. I guess. Let's say it like this. Let's everybody mute yourselves to start. This is being recorded, hopefully using the feature where it goes directly to YouTube. The shiurim are not going to be publicly listed, where you can, just by searching on YouTube for now, you can find them, but they will be made available for anybody who is so interested. I do not know if anybody else is joining us via Zoom or what exactly the story is, but we're going to get started. The one thing that I would say at the outset is that this is not any kind of like secret thing. For a variety of reasons, I did not make like a public announcement at the beginning. It's a little bit of a dry run of something that maybe after Yontif will take a more permanent kind of form. And again, I would love it, maybe even within Elul, if we could find an outdoor possibility as well. Some people said that we can at least, again, that means you have to wear masks. It gets a little more complicated. So maybe it's not worth it quite yet, but we'll see. All of this is a work in progress. I want to make sure, do you guys, has everybody, first of all, has everybody have access to the Makoros that I sent out earlier today? I sent out 2 batches of Makoros, right? One was the just the Yerushalmi and the Mishnayos, and then I sent something longer a little while back. So does everybody have access to those? Again, I can share them and put them on the screen and all of that. I just want to know in advance if people have, don't have. All right, we'll make it work one way or another. Jeremy, are you the 847 number?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I'll be in front of a computer in about 5 minutes, but Ski is a little bit later here than in Pittsburgh.
Got it. So again, so just to introduce the people on the group, I'm hoping that this will be a little bit of a, again, that it's billed as a Chabura, not as a shiur, and the hope is that there will be, some interactive and a little bit of a chevra building of sorts. So from Pittsburgh right now, we have Ari Spiro and CJ Argue. Ari, I was about to say at the upper left hand of the screen, but honestly, I have no idea what anybody else's screen looks like. One of the many fallacies of Zoom. And then the 847 number at the bottom is my cousin, Jeremy Meisel from Chicago, who is hopefully going to be learning with us at least tonight as well. So the agenda that I would like to pursue for the next few weeks is to deal with the sugyas of what I'm calling for the moment, the tension between Shabbos and Yontif, right? And that is the question which exists in various areas, both of halacha and of minhag, of the question of how do Shabbos and Yontif go together, right? So we know, in other words, that it's a fact of life that sometimes you are going to have a overlap, right, between Shabbos and Yontif. Certainly, when it comes to Shavuos, when it comes to Sukkot and to Pesach, inevitably there's going to be overlap, right? And it's hardwired into the system that at least the Chol HaMoed is going to interact. At the same time, right, there's the question, right, and it is both on the one hand, it's a technical question, right, that sometimes is everything that you are mechuyev to do on Yontif, right, really Shabbos friendly, right? And again, that there are certain kinds of things that are very stark versions of this. So to take 2 examples, right, one is Ketziras HaOmer, right? So we have a mitzvah that we're supposed to harvest the grain that is offered for the Korban HaOmer on the second day of Pesach on that night, right? And it's clear, and again, we'll touch on this again, the Mishnayos and Menachos make it clear, right, that this was done on Shabbos, right? And they made a big deal of the fact that it was done on Shabbos. right? So here's a place where there is something that is objectively, right? Ktsira is, an av malacha, and you can't get something less Shabbosdik than Ktsira, right? Another example is the question of Karban Pesach, right? The offering of the Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach, right? Sometimes, in fact, this year, as the calendar is currently set up, right? Erev Pesach is scheduled to be on Shabbos, right? So the halacha is clear. The Gemara in Pesachim says that you clearly offer the Karban Pesach on Shabbos. Right? It's an interesting question. The Gemara seems to say you're supposed to then stay put, right, and then bring it home after Shabbos to cook it, right? But the idea is, here's an example where you have a what's seemingly a contradiction between Shabbos and Yantiv, right? And there, right, the mitzvah of Yantiv overrides Shabbos, right? And we can get involved in the details, but this follows in many, many aspects of halacha, right? Again, it's interesting that Simchas Torah is in our current calendar. Simchas Torah never falls on Shabbos, right? And the calendar is set up in such a way, it's not clear that's the reason it's set up, but it happens to be that you can never have Simchas Torah on Shabbos, right? It would be a very interesting question. What would happen if Simchas Torah was on Shabbos? Right? Can you do Simchas Torah on Shabbos? Simchas Torah itself seems to include kulas and hilchos Yom Tov. Right? There's that again. It's a without putting too fine a point on it. Right? Technically speaking, you're not really supposed to dance on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Right? That's a mission in Beitzah. And yet the minhag going back to the time of the Gaonim is to dance anyways. And one of the approaches to that particular question, again, is because it's Yantiv Sheni, right? It's not such a big issue. What about Shmini Atzeres in Israel? Right, so Shmini Atzeres in Israel, as Simchas Torah, is a relatively late addition. Right, it was imported. Simchas Torah starts in Galus. It's a minhag that actually starts in Bavel during the time of the Gaonim. There probably was no Simchas Torah in Eretz Yisrael at all on Shmini Atzeres, and it's a later import, right? And it's an interesting question. What happens, again, when it's a question of technicalities, right? And that is one level that we're going to deal with, is to deal with how do we deal with the possibility where Chil Shabbos could potentially be an issue when it comes to Yantiv. At the same time, I think that there is perhaps a more kind of conceptual issue as well. And that has to do with the question of how do you balance the relative kedushos of the days? In other words, right, that if one is going to be very kind of technical about things, right, it's possible to say that Yantiv is some combination of Shabbos minus and Shabbos plus. In other words, it's Shabbos without Ochal Nefesh, right? It's Shabbos missing those critical aspects. Or it's Shabbos plus you have specific obligations, right? It's Shabbos, but you also have to sit in the sukkah, right? And again, there's actually a whole interesting, I didn't write this down in my notes, it hit me. There's a whole interesting discussion in the Rishonim of whether that has to do with the question of, is there a chiv of lachamishna and yantif, and how does that deal with, I don't remember who says, there's one sheet in the Rishonim that you use a matzah and a half at the Seder on normal years, right? That's the din of lechem oni, because lechem oni, the Gemara says, darko shel ani v'prusa, that a poor person eats a broken piece of bread, right? So that's all you need as far as Pesach is concerned. But when Pesach and Shabbos is together, you have the overlay, so you need the third matzah. Again, not everybody holds that way, but the point is that like it's yet another manifestation of this idea that you have like different obligations. But above and beyond that, there's also what I would call the nature of Shabbos versus the nature of Yantif. In other words, the Shabbos has a distinct philosophical, ideological identity, right? That Shabbos is about everything we know that Shabbos is about, and that Yantiv is fundamentally something else, right? That Yantiv is about, each distinct Yantiv has its own flavor. Underlying all Yantiv is a concept of simcha, right, which doesn't exist on Shabbos, right? Put simply. I will add parenthetically, I always find it ironic. I get questions about this every so often, that there seems to be a feeling that people have that if they have some kind of a Yontif Shabbos mashup, right? Either one day is Yontif or it's a 3-day Yontif, right? That certainly when it's Shabbos, they have to have fleishiks, right? So that like, we're going to have a 3-day Yontif, we should have fleishiks on Shabbos, so we're going to have milchiks on Friday. And I'm not sure why people think that. And there's, again, I think that's because there's this, that if you're going to really think it through, right, again, and that's this issue of the themes, right? Really, the Friday of the 3-day Yontif, if you're triaging, right, and you think it's an issue, I'm not convinced it's an issue, but fine. If you're triaging, you should have the fleishiks on Yontif, right, and have the milchiks on Shabbos Chol Moed, right? This is what you need to have. Like, there's nothing in Shabbos, right, that has the same, again, if we're just stacking chiyuvim, it's certainly more part of the theme of the day, right? You know what I'm saying? To be able to have meat on Yontif, right? So that I think is a misconception about the same idea. But I think that lurking behind the technical issues, right, is this kind of almost like a hashkafa concern of there's a discomfort, right, with the idea of Shabbos and Yontif together, and the idea that somehow they don't necessarily like fit together so smoothly, right? Again, this is an issue that's going to come up again and again this year, because again, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeres are all going to be on Shabbos, right? And it plays itself all out in all kinds of weird ways, right? Do you sing Zmiros when Yontif and Shabbos come together? Now, again, as far as halacha is concerned, right, whether you sing Zmiros or you sing Atzav Chartanu, right, is not really, kind of like one of these things that keeps people up at night, wondering about it, right? But conceptually, the idea of like, okay, today is Shabbos. Shabbos, I sing Zmiros, right? But if I sing Zmiros, am I somehow turning Yontif into Shabbos, right? Am I losing, right, what is special and unique as far as it's concerned, right? The idea there are fundamentally different kedushos, right? There are different that again, if we even want to get like a little Kabbalistic about it, that Shabbos and Yontif plug into different places, right? That is going to definitionally cause certain issues. Now, to take a moment to talk a little bit about the history of this. It's interesting to note that we have one shita in Chazal that really is the most expansive, I would say, about the idea of Yontif overlaying Shabbos. So it's not completely a Yontif issue, right? This is the approach of Rebbe Lazar in the Gemara in Shabbos, in the parak that is known by his name, Rebbe Lazar de Mila, right? Where he has this really radical shita that when there is a mitzvah that applies on Shabbos, not like, again, a Yontif mitzvah or something like Bris Milah is another example. Not only is the mitzvah fundamentally Docha Shabbos, right? That obligation applies on Shabbos particularly. Why we're not going to deal with tonight, but that's the shita. So he says, Lulav v'chol machshirav docha Shabbos, right? Lulav, not just the actual mitzvah of lulav, right? But anything that you need to do in order to bench lulav, right? So Rabbi Lezer says, if you don't have a lulav, right, you can go outside, chop down a palm tree, right, to be able to get it, to be able to have a lulav to be able to use. And he goes further, sukkah v'chol machshira dochenes haShabbos, matzah v'chol machshira dochenes haShabbos. So this is like pretty wild, right? And there's the idea that Rabbi Lezer fundamentally holds that for the mitzvah of matzah, right, if I want to bake my matzah, right, or let's say I didn't have, again, there's a whole lumdus in this. Does he hold, again, to use the technical terms, does Rabbi Lezer hold hutra or tchuya? In other words, does he mean that it's like completely okay, or it's only in the more limited circumstance, right, that like, I don't know, whatever, you're, you open the box and you find out your kid ate all the matzah, last week when you weren't looking, right? So we normally would say, right, maybe go to a neighbor or something, right? But the bottom line is, Rabbi Lezer says you can actually bake the matzah on Shabbos, right? And there's the need to do it is so significant, right, that it's actually Docha Shabbos as far as it's concerned. Now, again, it's a radical shita that we don't accept, right? But it would seem, right, that again, if we were going to conceptualize Rebbe Lazar's approach, and again, there are drashas involved as well. But the bottom line is what he says is these unique mitzvahs are so significant, right, that they kind of like don't even worry about Shabbos as far as those things are concerned. CJ, you look like you're going to say something.
Yeah. So, for something like baking matzah, you can do that on Yontif. But something like sukkah, say, your sukkah falls down. Would he hold that you should build your sukkah on Yontif?
I believe so. In other words, I believe that the shita, in other words, the same way that applies on, again, you can get into the questions of, if you can use someone else's, you can be mafalpa a little bit in terms of, again, remember that this is a dormant shita, right? And it's like, we don't necessarily have as expansive a literature in terms of like what exactly would hold. But again, on a simple level, my understanding is that his shita is, right, that the need of the mitzvah is so significant, right? The same way that the mitzvah, he says, not only is the mitzvah Docha Shabbos, but anything that is, he has, again, this very wide category. And again, he talks about when it comes to bris milah, even like, like melting metal to make a knife to be able to do the bris. Right now, again, I don't know how to make a knife, so I don't know how much it would help me, right? And I don't actually know how to circumcise, so we're kind of done with that part of the conversation, right? But the point is, and it's certainly a very radical idea. Now, lahavdil, it's very interesting to note that in the world of Jews at the time of Bayis Sheni, right? So we know, right? Those of you people are familiar from the Mishnayos that we have all of these kinds of sectarian groups lurking in the corners, right? And the Chazal are very concerned about these groups and the influence that these groups have on other people, right? So you have the Tzdukim and you have the Baitusim, right? So we've lost, I think, a lot of the fine tuning of what's the difference between these groups, right? You imagine somebody, 1,000 years ago trying to figure out like what's a conservative and what's a reconstructionist. And it was like, certainly they knew what the terms meant. And again, the reality is the terms actually, generally terms like this shift in meaning, right? But we see in a number of different places in halacha, right, that the issue of Shabbos was a flashpoint between the Chachamim and these sectarian groups, right? It's true when it comes, so some of it is fun. So one of the famous debates, the date of Shavuos, right? So Shavuos on the sectarian calendar, right? And this on some level is based on the pasuk of Mimachas Shabbos, right? Is that Shavuos is always, you start Sfiras HaOmer on the Sunday during or after Pesach, right? And then Shavuos is always going to be on a Sunday, right? Now, it's interesting. I'm not going to go through the whole piece. We could really get distracted the same way, right? That Rebbe Tzadok has a whole interesting analysis of what did the Tzdukim really hold, and there's what lay behind this idea, right? Which is a really interesting. The idea there's actually like it's not just a detail issue, and there's the idea that somehow and that somehow is part of what's driving them, right? Is this different understanding of what Shabbos is about. Now we happen to know a lot more about sectarian Jews during the time of Bayis Sheni than we used to, right? Because we have this whole library from Qumran, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Which suddenly give us, again, this is not a lecture about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they help us understand Chazal. I'll give you that some other time, right? But that it's fascinating because what you really find in those books is the photographic negative of Chazal, right? And you actually have Mishnayos in Ukts, in Yadayim, right? That talks about the Chachamim saying, this is what the Tzdukim hold. And in Qumran, you have the flip side. You have a letter that says, this is what we hold. And it's exactly what you find in the Mishnah, right? And there's so who they were, that's a whole different topic. But one of the interesting things we know in Qumran is that in Qumran, they had a calendar, right? They had a different calendar, right? That they broke away from the traditional calendar. They set up a new calendar. The calendar was a largely solar calendar. But one of the features of it is that it was set up in such a way, right? of being able to avoid any of the days of Yom Tif itself ever falling on Shabbos, right? Which again, so you have kind of these two ends of the spectrum. You have the Shita of Rebbe Elazar, right, who basically says fundamentally, right, that Yom Tif in many instances almost trumps Shabbos, right? And as you take Yom Tif and you run with it, like that's the mitzvah that is, again, whether it's more timely, it's more pressing, whether it's a specific Xeris HaKosov, whatever exactly, however you do the work, right? And certainly the result is that you have one Shita that sees Yom Tif as having tremendous power, right? And that it's there against the backdrop of the sectarian approach that says, no, like we're scared of having Yom Tov and Shabbos together too much, right? We don't want Yom Tov and Shabbos together, that they have to be kept completely separate, right? And that really the path of the Masorah, or the main path of the Masorah, I'm going to suggest is something somewhat in between, but that it continues to be an unsettled kind of issue. And there are all kinds of weird questions in halacha. There's a question, there are communities that are minhag not to duchen when Shabbos falls on Yom Tif, or when Yom Tif falls on, however you like thinking about it, right? So it's a whole question where such a minhag comes from, but all of these different kinds of pieces, right, to me, all suggest that there is this fundamental tension that exists. So all that is by way of background to bringing us to the question of shofar. Jeremy.
Do you need to say that the sectarian is the opposite end of
to say anything, but yeah.
is the opposite end of the spectrum from Rabbi Elazar? Meaning, you can also look at it that they view things from the same way as Rabbi Eliezer, but they don't want to come to that conflict where Shabbos is thereby marginalized, and so they try to.
There's like, again, sometimes it's like like in politics, right? And there's where like the left and the right, like kind of like at some point like meet some place if you get so radical. So it could be, there's that they have that. Again, I'm a little uncomfortable putting them in the same sentence, right? And that perhaps there is a kind of purist, or like you really want to keep things. There's that you see the trumping, as it were, as so significant, right? That would go. So I think you can play with it. I think there's definitely room to move. Okay, good. So let's start. Give me one second. I just want to put the. I want to start with the Mishnayos and Rosh Hashanah as our point of departure. So give me 1 second here. Bear with me. Okay, you should have the Mishnayos on the screen. Yeah, yes, no. Mishnayos are not coming up on the screen?
All right, we can see.
As you started screen sharing, oh, there they are. Now I got them.
Okay. Okay, so let's take a look quickly. Did people have a chance to quickly look over the Mishnayos here? Okay, so let's try to read the Mishnayos, forgetting everything that we ever learned before, right? And again, as some of you may have gone through parts of the sugya beforehand, but let's try as much as possible to approach this with a blank slate. So the Mishnah says as follows: Yom Tov shel Rosh Hashanah shechalios b'Shabbos b'mikdash hayu token avalo b'medina. He says when the Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, right, they would blow shofar in the Beis HaMikdash, but they would not blow in what the Mishnah here calls the Medina. So for purposes of simplicity, the Rambam would not necessarily agree, but to keep things simple for the moment, we're going to say you blow shofar in the Beis HaMikdash, but not anywhere that's not the Beis HaMikdash. Mishachar of Beis HaMikdash, Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Shiyutokin b'chol makom sheyesh bo bezdin. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that any place where there is a bezdin. And then you have a debate. Amar Rabbi Elazar lo hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai b'yavin bilchad. Rabbi Elazar says this halacha was only made specifically in Yavne, right? This was not a general pronouncement for Bezdin. Amrulo, and they were responding to him, Echad Yavne ve'echad kol makom sheyesh ba Bezdin. It doesn't matter, Yavne, and also any place where there is a Bezdin. Right? That's the statement here of the first Mishnah. We'll hold off for the moment in the next two Mishnahs. Okay, so what is the obvious question that we have to ask on essentially the first clause in the Mishnah?
What's different about the Beit HaMikdash and everywhere else?
Okay, so number one, we have to understand there is this distinction made between the Beis HaMikdash on the one hand, right, and everywhere else, right? The idea that you have one halacha in the Beis HaMikdash and one halacha everywhere else, right? On this particular, and there's something particularly strange about in this very specific circumstance. In other words, to take a different example, which is actually rooted in the third Mishnah, it says, "Berishona lulav nitzal b'mikdash shiva v'medina yom echad, mishachar beis hamikdash hiskinu miyochim zakish lulav nitzal b'medina shiva zeichel mikdash." So here we have a very simple thing. We learn from that there are two mitzvos of lulav, right? There's the mitzvah of lulav on the first day, which is the universal mitzvah. There's a mitzvah of lulav on the 7 days of Sukkot, which is a Beis Hamikdash mitzvah, which again is rooted in the pasuk, which says, "Usmachtem livnei Hashem Elokeichem shivas yamim." Right, you rejoice before God for 7 days. Right, so there's the idea that Sukkot in the Beis Hamikdash apparently has a different contour than Sukkot everywhere else. But here we have this even stranger kind of idea, right? That Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos is different in the Beis Hamikdash than everywhere else. Right, so we'd have to kind of understand and define what this distinction between the Mikdash and everything else is about. Good. What else requires explanation here?
In Mishnah Gimel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is very clear that the reason for lulav is zecher lemikdash. That is noticeably absent from Mishnah Aleph. Is unsaid, or is it?
Good. So it's a very good question in terms of, is this a Zecher Lemikdash at all or not? In other words, Lulav Kol Shiva, right? The use of the Lulav, I think I gave a shir on this last Sukkot maybe, right? But the mitzvah of Lulav for the week of Sukkot today, right? The Mishnah is very explicit that it is a Zecher Lemikdash, right? That we do this again in order to develop an appetite for the mitzvahs of the Beis Hamikdash that we shouldn't forget, right? We continue to do this, right? So here, right, even though there is this institution, there's a perpetuation apparently of the Beis Hamikdash model of doing this, right? It certainly does not say explicitly that it's Zeichel Hamikdash. Now there are Rishonim that hold that way, and perhaps we'll get to that eventually. It's certainly one way to go, but again, I think it certainly is worth noting it's not explicit in the Mishnah for sure. Good. What else?
Blowing shofar is not a malacha. Why can't you?
Okay. Well, okay. So you've already advanced even a step, right? Let's take it a step back before we even get to that, right? What's the problem, right? There's the Mishnah kind of presents it as you don't do it on Shabbos outside of the Beis Hamikdash, right? And the question is why, right? So again, we already, we looked at so Rav Eliezer Demila has this like extreme position that I can do anything, right? And I can, like as long as I'm fulfilling one of these particular mitzvos, right? I can, and again, it's interesting, it's you can say, well, like I need to go hear shofar. I'm going to get in the car to go hear shofar, right? And that really would be, I believe, again, consistent with Rav Eliezer's approach. Certainly if I have no other way of getting there, I can drive to be able to do that, right? But here, right, the Mishnah almost takes it for granted that there's some kind of an issue, apparently, of blowing shofar outside of the Beis Hamikdash and does not explain why. And we don't know why it's okay in one place and not okay somewhere else, right? It's not defined within the Mishnah. Good. What else?
We also don't have clarity about why Yavne is a better place or more permissible place to blow than anywhere else.
Okay,
At least
good.
according to Rabbi Yosef.
So, and again, this raises a little bit of a question of going back to Jeremy's point about Zeichel Mikdash, right? What is it, right? So again, we have two iterations of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai presented in the Mishnah, right? One is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai essentially kind of transformed Yavne into the equivalent of the Beis Hamikdash, and I don't know what that means. Or, and this seems to be the majority understanding, that b'chol makom sheyesh bo bezdin, any place with a bezdin, I can blow shofar on Shabbos, right? So what is that all about? And it was like, what does it mean that we're perpetuating what was once a Beis Hamikdash practice, any place that there is a bezdin? And by the way, an open question as well is, what does bezdin even mean? Right? There's the term bezdin can refer to all kinds of things. Right? Is it a bezdin shel gimel? Is it a bezdin shel chaf gimel? Is it a bezdin shel ayin aleph? Right? And depending on how you understand which bezdin we're talking about, right? That this Mishnah could be understood as giving a much wider circle of places that can blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah Shabbos. Right? If it's really any place the bezdin, that's pretty expansive. Right? There are lots of places with a bezdin that you can blow. If it's a bezdin, if you're going to have a higher standard, chaf gimel, ayin aleph, whatever it is, then you have to define, well, what is it like? What's the logic behind that, right? And behind any of these positions, like let's say it's, again, if we're going to argue, even if it's a bezdin shel gimel, so why should the bezdin shel gimel be the continuation of the Beis Hamikdash, right? So these are again a lot of questions. In terms of having to understand these, some of these are already taken up by the Amoraim in terms of trying to answer the questions. And that brings us to our point of departure, which is the Yerushalmi. So let me try to shift this over here. Okay, is the Yerushalmi on the screen now? Can you everybody see that? Yeah, it's Gemara. Yeah, with me?
Nope, can't see it.
I still have the Mishnayos.
Okay, so hold on. Let me reshare. Better? Yeah, is it on the screen now?
Yes.
All right, amazing. Okay. Okay, so Yishalmi says like this. Okay, Rav Amar Papa Amar Rav Yochanan, Rav Shimon Lakish, how Yisivin Makashe. So Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish are sitting down and they're asking questions to each other, and they're asking on the Mishnah. And it says like they said, the Mishnah says Yom Tov Shal Rosh Hashanah Shacharis B'Shabbos B'Mikdash Hayu Token Avelo B'Medina. He says, so the Mishnah says that you blow in the Beis Hamikdash and not outside. In Dvar Torah who Av Yidcha Begvulin, Av Begvulin Yidcha, is if this is really, if there is really a from the Torah, right, that's Kiyas Shofar is Docha Shabbos, right, then you should do it everywhere. He says, Lesu Dvar Torah. However, if it is not a Torah obligation, right, if there's no Torah permission to do it, Av Mikdash Lo Yidcha. He says, then you shouldn't be allowed to do it. So in other words, the opening question, and again, if you look here in the Karban Ha'eda, right, the Karban Ha'eda says that the question that they're assuming here is the Savri Tkiyas Shofar Malachi. They assumed that it must be there's some kind of a malacha of Tkiyas Shofar. I don't know what that means, what malacha that would be exactly, but the assumption seems to be, right, the question is, like, that this doesn't really make any sense. It should be either binary, either it's mutter or it's aser. And this, how can it be? It's mutter in the Beis Hamikdash, or maybe an obligation in the Beis Hamikdash and not anywhere else. Over Kahana, Amrin Hagav Rabbah initially. So Rav Kahana comes by and they say, oh, here's a great person that we can ask this question to. Asun Shulale. They go and they ask him. Amar Loni says to them, Ksiv Echad Omer Yom Shua. Because of Echad Omer Zichron Shua. So the Torah refers to Rosh Hashanah using two different terms, right? One term that it uses is Yom Trua, and the other is Zichron Trua. Now, Yom Trua, I think I know what it means, right? Yom Trua means a day of blowing shofar, right? Zichron Trua is a little bit harder to translate exactly, right? A memorial of shofar blowing. So he says, why does it have two names? Haketzad, b'shoshu chal b'chol yom trua, b'shoshu chal b'shabbos zichron trua, maskirin avalo token. He says, when it comes to Shabbos, then it's called zichron trua. Then it's called a memorial of trua, but you don't blow shofar, right? So the Yerushalmi here seems to be making the assertion that the Torah itself has a two-tiered approach to Rosh Hashanah, right? Or certainly to the midst of shofar, and certainly I think it's not impossible to say to Rosh Hashanah. There are two modalities of Rosh Hashanah. So in Parshas Emor, we're told that there is something called Zichron Shua, and in Bamidbar, right, in Parshas Pinchas, in the Maftir, we're told Yom Trua Yelachem, that it is a day of Trua. So the Yerushalmi says here we have a makar from the Torah itself, that this is in fact a daraisa, right? That there's one thing called Yom Trua and one thing called Zichron Trua. So why does this not apply, right? So that there seems to be in general this fundamental distinction. It doesn't have to do with malacha. It has to be, the Torah says there's the Shabbos version of Rosh Hashanah and there's the non-Shabbos version of Rosh Hashanah. However, let's go back to the Yerushalmi here. So Yerushalmi says, Kasav Echad Omer Yom Trua, Kasav Echad Omer Zichron Trua. HaKetzad, Mishash Chal B'Shal Yom Trua, B'Shal Zichron Trua, Maskirin of Avalo Token. Me'ata Av Mikdash Lo Yidcha. He says that from here it would seem that in the Beis HaMikdash, right, again, so if you're going to tell me, fine, it's not an issue of malacha, it's an issue of these two different identities, Zichron Trua and Yom Trua. So the Yerushalmi then gives two limudim that come back from the Psukim. So the first is that that the Be'echad L'chodesh over here means in a place where you know with certainty when Rosh Chodesh is, right? So again, under normal conditions, right? The Kriyas HaChodesh takes place in the Lishkas Hagazis, right, on the Harabayis, right? So in that place, and this goes back, maybe we're not up to talking about Bezdin, right? This might be the first hint that it's the Bezdin function of the Beis HaMikdash that's somehow connected. That's the first approach. Now, it's a little bit of a funny limud I'm sorry. Here's the, because you have the term Be'echad L'chodesh in both, right? So it would be really cute if you just had it over here, right? So hold on a second. So the way the Korban Eidah explains this like this. He says, "D'chsiv echad b'chodesh yelchem shabbason zichron shua mikra kodesh etc. U'v'chodesh chomesh hapkudim ksiv be'echad l'chodesh mikra kodesh yelachem melechas avodah lo sasu yom shua yelachem v'asisim ala kasal kadaitach dachi kamar be'echad b'chodesh yelachem shabbason aval agavoa ina shabbason." So the way the Korban Eidah, let me just explain this again, right? In that the first pasuk we have the word Shabbason, right? So in here, right, Zichron, when Echad L'chodesh is Shabbason, then it's Zichron Shua, and that's usually the drasha. The second drasha is B'chodesh Hashvi B'echad L'chodesh Mikra Kodesh Yelachem. Right, this is the Yantif. There's no Shabbason connected to it, and that's when you have Yom Trua. Right, it's not a super easy drasha. The second drasha of Rashbi is a little bit easier to understand. Rashbi says, Tani Rashbi, v'hikravtem b'makom shehakorbanos craving. So here he sees a little bit differently, and here where you have a discussion of the world of korbanos, right? That's where it says Yom Trua, that it's always going to be Yom Trua in the Beis Hamikdash, right? Okay, that's up till here's the Yerushalmi, and that's the end of the discussion of the Yerushalmi. We come away from the Yerushalmi with the conclusion that the difference between Shabbos and Yantiv is something which is fundamentally rooted in the Torah. Two modalities of Rosh Hashanah, or two aspects of Rosh Hashanah, one which is called Zichron Trua and one which is called Yom Trua, and that they identify themselves as that for whatever reason, the Beis Hamikdash, it's always Yom Trua. Okay.
Wait, can you go back to the Korban Eidah? Because V'hikravtem, Bamidbar in general is talking about Korbanos, but the word V'hikravtem is in Emor. In Bamidbar is V'asisem.
Right. So so the Korban Eidah plays with this, and I think there actually is a question of yourselves here. He says Midachsiv V'hikravtem Rachok min Zichron Trua. V'asisem ksiv samach yom trua. Let's go back to the psukim. So the way that he wants to read it is Yom Trua is immediately followed by V'asisem, and V'hikravtem in Vayikra is separated by all this other stuff, right? So again, it's also, it's not, I think that if you took a step, again, we can't totally rewrite it, right? And there's the idea that in the context of the Beis Hamikdash, it says Yom Trua. So again, it's not super simple, which parenthetically begs the question. It is possible that the Yerushalmi has a different, again, I haven't, this is more of an impression and something that people I've spoken to who are holding Yerushalmi more have validated, that the derech of the Yerushalmi in general is it wants to find psukim. You know, again, I think people probably are familiar with this feeling that drashos in general are kind of the, for us, the most opaque part of learning Gemara, right? And there's that it's very hard. You're like, do we learn from this word? Do we learn from that word? Like I said to somebody once that it's like, if you ever like played a board game or watched people playing a board game that you don't know how to play the game, that each time you think you figured out the rules, they do something like, wait, what just happened? Like I thought it was following this. And like, you know, after like years of learning Gemara, I still feel that way about the drashos. And there's the idea that like, that clearly that they understood what they were trying to accomplish. And there's a whole question that exists of, you know, are all drashos created equally? You know, are drashos, is everything that's connected to a pasuk, when is it a drasha, when is it an asmachta, right? And it's possible that the Yerushalmi in general, for whatever reason, really likes psukim as part of the derech halimud, right? I don't know what to tell you, right? But certainly the conclusion one reaches is that these are things that are, again, that I mean, without making too much of an assumption, right? This division of Rosh Hashanah into Zichron Trua Rosh Hashanah and Yom Trua Rosh Hashanah would seem to indicate that these are two alternative paths to the same goal, right? And certainly one way of kind of taking this idea and running with it, right, would be to say, okay, well, what does it mean, right? How is, right, Shabbos Rosh Hashanah fundamentally different than Yontif Rosh Hashanah? They're both Rosh Hashanah, right? That you've stripped away the Trua and replaced it with Zichron Trua. So again, just I don't have a clear understanding of this, but I just want to show you a Shemi Shmuel that I will admit to you I don't understand, but I think that it's very suggestive of one way of developing this distinction, right? He says, he says you can give a reason why there's no Tkiyas Shofar on Shabbos. That the shofar does not take you higher than where you go on Shabbos. The Shnei in a Malim with Davkim B'Shorsham as Hadvarim Hanmuchim Shem V'Vchinas Yesod Ha'Ofer V'Domim Sheshorsham Ein Magia L'Shalosh Osios Rishonos. So I do not know what this means, right? And there's the thrust of it, right? What's important for us is that the Shemi Shmuel says that there is what you achieve through Shabbos is comparable to what you achieve through Yontif. And this is the important line. V'chol ma she'osa shofar hu asui v'omed al yedei kedushas Shabbos me'eleha. He says whatever the shofar accomplishes, right, is already done through Shabbos, right? So I leave this kernel of an idea to you to think about. But I think that within this Yerushalmi, I think that idea is very significant. Now, so now it's interesting to know, and this is where we're going to start next time. The Bavli completely rejects this idea. So the Bavli starts on similar ground. Minani mili Amar of Levi Bar Lachma Amar Cham Bar Chanina. Kosav Echad Omer Shabbos on Zichron Shura. Because of Echad Omer Yom Shura Yelachem. Right? It just presents it. You have the two psukim. Right? It's really the same drasha as we found in the Yerushalmi Lo Kasha. Kan biyant shechalios b'Shabbos. Kan biyant shechalios b'chol. Beautiful. Right, they're learning the same way in the Galil as they are in Bavel. Amar Rava imidaraisahi b'mikdash heicha takinan. So the first question, which is the answer which the Yerushalmi resolves, that if this is a fundamental Torah distinction, then why does it apply in the Beis Hamikdash? So the Gemara does not offer any of the reasons, right, that the Yerushalmi does. The Ode. Holav malachi to itzrich kra l'meute. So then ask a question. I don't even understand what the problem is, right? If there was a fundamental conflict, right? In other words, I don't know what to do, right? The shofar is Chil Shabbos. When Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos, how can I blow shofar? So then the Torah resolves it. He says, what needs to be resolved? What would be so terrible about blowing shofar on Shabbos, right? Ditana deveshmal komalach zavoda losa. So yotzet kias shofar dias apas shichachma ve'ena malacha. Right. That here again, without getting dias apas is a whole sugi in its own right. Right. But he quotes a source that says that when the Torah says not to do malacha, that shofar is definitely not a malacha. Ela amar Rava midaraisa mishra shari. Rava says daraisa it's totally fine. V'Rabbanan who degozerve kiderabba. He says, and it was the Rabbanan who decreed against it. As Rabbah said, to Amar Rabbah, Hakol chayovin b'tkiyas shofar, ve'ein hakol b'kiyan b'tkiyas shofar. As Amar Rabbah, excuse me, ve'ein hakol b'kiyan b'tkiyas shofar. He says, look, everybody's got to blow shofar. Not everybody knows what they're doing. Gzeira shema yitlenu v'yadav v'yelchet v'abaki l'mod v'yavirenu arba amos v'shtarat. So I'm sure people have probably run across this. This is the explanation of the Bavli. Has nothing to do with Daraisas. What we're concerned about is maybe you'll come to a situation where someone will unwittingly take the shofar and carry it on Shabbos, right, and wind up violating Shabbos in the process. That's the reason behind it. It says v'hainu taima de lulav, v'hainu taima de Megillah, and that's the same reason why we don't bench lulav on Shabbos, and that's the same reason why we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos. Right. So Rabbah's approach, which is the conclusion of the Bavli, is that everything we said until now ostensibly is not relevant. Right. It's not a daraisa at all. It has nothing to do with the psukim, right? But we have instead a technical conflict. Now, again, that doesn't mean that some of the meta issues that we talked about are not here. In other words, it's fascinating to see, right, that a relatively far-fetched possibility of Chil Shabbos was seen as so significant, right, that we put the mitzvah to the side, right? There's the idea that Yantif would lead you to the possibility of Chil Shabbos, right? And there's that could be the result of the conflict, right? Was enough to create this really quite draconian gzeira. Right? But that's the conclusion that the Bavli makes over here. So I want to show you two last things, and then we'll take anybody has any questions, and then we'll go back to kind of looking much more closely at gzeira deraba. So I'm going to skip this, a really cute piece from Yosef Engel, but we'll get to that next week. But I just want to show you one interesting thing here. So if you take a look at the tour in Hilchos Rosh Hashanah, right? This is in where's Tafkuf Beis, right? The tour says as follows: because of Od, Shemchal Rosh Hashanah b'chol Omer Yom Trua Mikra Kodesh, v'imchal b'Shabbos Omer Zichron Trua Mikra Kodesh, v'chein Noagin ba'Ashkenaz. So he brings this really interesting position, right? That this is to be reflected liturgically, right? That when we are davening on Rosh Hashanah, right, we pay attention to this Yom Trua versus Zichron Trua. Then on Shabbos we say Zichron Trua, and during the week we say Yom Trua. Now, the problem is, right, so this goes beautifully according to the Yerushalmi, right? According to the Bavli, which again we would assume is where we are generally kovea halacha from, right? That if we are going to take that position, right, then it's a little bit funny, right, that we are basically taking what seems to be a rejected drasha, right, that it has nothing to do with Zichron Shura versus Yom Trua, and we put it into davening, right? And this again, and you'll see, God willing, we're going to come a couple weeks to Rosh Hashanah, right? All over the Machzor, it's going to tell you, say Zichron Shura in all of these places. Now, the Beis Yosef quotes a Maseches Sofrim. Right, so Maseches Sofrim is not a Mishnah; it's what's called Masechtos Ktanos, and that's where this minhag originally comes from. And he says, "Imchal Rosh Hashanah lios b'Shabbos ein omer Yom Trua Zichron Trua, lefi she'ein tkiyas Shabbat Shabbos b'Gvulin mishum gzeira." So this is really funny, right? There's like the Maseches Sofrim here says we still have the minhag to preserve the drasha, even though he's explicit, right, that we do it because of the gzeira, right? That it's the Maseches Sofrim does not hold like the Yerushalmi that it's the drasha, right? That there's a din da'araisa, that there's no shofar on Shabbos. No, he says that we do it almost as a reminder of the gzeira, right? He then quotes a very cute thing, which is the Trumas Hadashan, who says, Yesh Lomar b'Kiddush v'Tfilas Arvis Zichron Shua. So this is really wild, right? As he says, again, we're not bound by the drasha. That's not really the makor, right? But the drasha is almost like a convenient reminder. He says that, so his theory is every Kiddush at night and Mariv every night of Rosh Hashanah, you should say Zichron Shua. Why? Because you don't blow shofar at night, right? There's no mitzvah blowing shofar at night. Right, so he has, again, I don't think he's making a fundamental statement. What he's saying is, he seems to understand this is almost like, I don't know, like it's a reminder, right? And there's that Yom Trua you only say during the day. And Yosef rejects it. He says, Aval ha'olam lo naguke. People don't do that. V'atam yishum lo dami l'Shabbos da'acha hu yoma zman shura hu l'machar. He says, no, it's not like Shabbos. Right? And then there's the nights of Rosh Hashanah, right? Yes, technically I'm not blowing shofar right now. I have no mitzvah to blow shofar, right? But it's still fundamentally a Yom Trua, right? Which is interesting. It's like the Beis Yosef says that this almost like hyper literalist kind of idea that you only say Yom Trua, you know, when you have the mitzvah literally on top of you. He says, no, it's not like Shabbos. Shabbos is not a Zman Trua at all, right? So what you seem to see here, right, is almost like that it's like the half-life of this idea, right? And that perhaps even if it doesn't totally work out technically, right, it continues to like it's still out there. And there's this idea that there is this difference is still out there. And I'll show you one place. Again, the truth is I never know exactly which piyutim we say in shul here at the beginning of Shachris, because I told them the one point of privilege I took at the outset when I first came to Pali Tzedek is I said, don't wait for me for Shemona Esrei and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Like 3 days a year, right? Let me down at my own pace. So I don't actually know what happens at the beginning of Chazar Shatz on Rosh Hashanah. I can tell you for sure we're not saying this year because there's all kinds of stuff but fine. So this piyut says again, just it's a piyut only for Shabbos on the first day. Tiv'o im b'chol yivo achem savu liskoa b'chol gvulchem yom trua yelochem. I skipped a line. Sorry. Chikem chanito liskoa b'zeh chodesh yom zem im yikar b'Shabbos kodesh zichron trua yelochem. Right. So here in the piyut, right, it has it built in. Right, that if it's on Shabbos, then it's a zichron trua. If it's during the week, then it's a yom trua. Right. Again, it's what I call the half-life of the drasha, which again, I think is partially because even if and we'll take a look at Rabbi Yosef Engel as a very clever way of trying to resolve the whole business, right? Not necessarily super compelling, but definitely worth looking at. It's interesting to contrast this with the Rambam. If you take a look at the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, where he goes through the different nuschos of Kiddush, the Rambam says like this. He says, Rosh Hashanah Omer, V'atitein lanu Hashem l'ken b'ahavas yom tov mikra kodesh hazeh, zichron shua mikra kodesh. The Rambam says that this yontiv is called zichron shua. Right? That is the proper technical formal name for the yontiv. Shabbos, Shabbos, Nain. It doesn't matter, right, whether it's Shabbos or Yontif. The Rambam holds, I didn't check with the contemporary Sephardim Machzorim have, but the Rambam basically says, and again, this is certainly consistent with what the Gemara seems to say, right? The Gemara has basically asks a bunch of questions, leaves it to the side and said, we're all working within a technical D'Rabbanan, right? We're dealing within this Gzeira of Shema Yavirema that maybe you're going to take it. And by the way, it's interesting that the Hagos Maimonios jumps on this. He says, Kach Omer Kishachal Rosh Hashanah Lios B'Shabbos. Kishachal B'Chol Omer Yom Trua. Right, so the Hagos Maimonios, right, which is the Ashkenazi response to the Mishnah Torah, right? He says, I don't know what you're talking about, right? We do, right, which is completely consistent with what we saw on the tour. That's only on Shabbos. Right? I don't know what this is. And the Rambam in the Seder Tfilos in the Siddur Rambam brings the same thing. Vatitein lanu Hashem Elokeinu es Yom Tov Mikra Kodesh Hazeh Zichron Shua B'Ava Zeich L'Yitzias Mitzrayim. Right, so it's interesting to see that, like, even in the Nusach HaTfilah, right, the question of these two approaches of the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and again, if you really wanted to be fancy about the whole thing, whether this is, we know that there are many elements of Minhag Ashkenaz that come originally from Minhag Eretz Yisrael. So the question of, is it possible that they preserved kind of fundamentally the approach of the Yerushalmi, right? And the Rambam is here really going straight based on the Gemara. That I haven't done enough research to be able to say that with certainty, but I think it is interesting to see how the Nusach HaTfilah itself reflects kind of this fundamental issue. Okay, any question on anything we talked about tonight? Okay, all right, so what we need to start with next week is to really try to drill down on the question of Gezerah D'Rabba, right? And there's the question of, like, what this is all about, right? And why it exists outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but not inside the Beis HaMikdash. And that will perhaps help us towards the question of what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was trying to accomplish by perpetuating what was done in the Beis HaMikdash. But again, I would say that if one takes the approach of if you take the approach of the Bavli, it would also seem to maybe be a point against saying that what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is doing is the Zeichel HaMikdash. Because the Zeichel HaMikdash, I would think, is about preserving something fundamental about the Beis HaMikdash. If it happens to be that they never made a Gzeira in the Beis HaMikdash, right? Like, why should I have a Zeicher to the lack of Gzeira? It's a weird kind of thing. Jeremy, you look like you unmuted yourself.
No, just for the end, just to say.
All right, terrific. All right, a good night to everyone. Again, if you know anybody who'd be interested in joining us next week, certainly we can get them the video, and we're happy to have them along. A good night to all.
All right, thank you.